what I want to talk about today is how the crucial role that metals played in the building of classical Greece, which was a surprise to me, someone who studied it for a while, uh, and the striking parallels that exist between the growth of the Athenian Empire, the rise of it, and also with that empire, the psychology of empire, which we also see interesting parallels about today, and also the importance of trade routes in the as the main objective of the war that of the finishing of the Peloponnesian War, the winning of the Peloponnesian War. So to give us a little bit of context, I have a slide here, metals in historical context, just to place us. So first of all, you had the Greek Bronze Age from 3000 to 1200 BC. Bronze, of course, is copper, that 90%, and tin that's added to it. And the copper it mostly came from Cyprus, which was the Saudi Arabia of copper of the time. And the tin came from as far as Cornwall and Afghanistan, way back in the Bronze Age. There's trade routes. In 1200 BC, there was the collapse of the Bronze Age. Scholars aren't exactly sure why it occurred. But with that collapse, some think environmental, some think Mycenaean, Greek invaders. But with that collapse came the collapse of the trade routes, importantly. And so in the early Iron Age, when civilization started to come back, the civilization started to use iron because it was more ubiquitous, it was easier to find, whereas rather than tin, which was no longer available, and the copper was harder to get. Early iron wasn't as good as bronze, interestingly, but they still used it because it was more readily available. In the Archaic period, they started to accidentally make steel from the iron by putting it in the bloomery furnaces, where the carbon would accidentally basically alloy with the iron, and they'd start to get steel. So it started to become a better product, but they didn't really industrialize the process till ancient Rome. But they were starting to do steel. And then in the Classical Age, which is where I'm going to focus on, they made a huge silver discovery in 483 BC. At the bottom of Attica there, you can see the Laurian silver mines, sometimes called Laurium silver mines. This is a mining district that existed since 3200 BC. And in 483 BC, they had made a huge silver discovery. And the Athenian democracy was 25 years old. And there was a big discussion in the assembly as to what to do with this silver discovery. There was talk about, giving everybody a dividend, and Themistocles basically advocated that they use it towards building up the fleet, adding more ships. They doubled the amount of triremes, or ships, that were and they became a naval power. And they also fortified the Piraeus, or the Athenian port. And so this led to them winning the Battle of Salamis, which was a naval battle, when the Persians returned in 480. And finally, they finished the job in Plataea, where there was a land battle, and they won. So this silver discovery, thanks to Themistocles, became crucial in winning this war, which really led to the foundation of Western civilization. Now, in 477 BC, three of the city-states in Ionia, which is on the western side of Turkey there, in green you see the Persian Empire. They were still worried that the Persians were going to invade. They didn't realize that they'd won the war yet. So three city-states in Ionia appealed to Athens as the naval power and said, "Can you protect us? We'll give you..." And the Athenians agreed. Aristides the Just agreed, and he assessed them, and they said, "Okay, we're going to need ships, and for all the city-states that can't afford ships, which were several, we're going to take what were called contributions." And so in 477 BC, they started the Delian League, which is basically a defense league, you might say similar to NATO, with Athens playing a similar role to the United States today. And they took in about 460 talents, and talents are silver. And what's super interesting about it is we can actually measure what that is in today's dollars. So at $90 per ounce silver, it's about $35 million that they took in. So about 10 years later, Kimon wins a battle at Eurymedon at the bottom there in Persia in 466. And there's a sense that the Persians are no longer a threat. Meanwhile, what you see up in northern Greece there near Thassos, you see the Pangaean mines. So the Laurian mines were great, and they also, now the Athenians, even though it was just a defense league, they want control of the Pangaean mines. And so Thassos was annoyed with this because that was part of their keep, so to speak. And so they revolted against the Athenians. And the Athenians then sailed over and laid siege to Thassos. Thassos makes an appeal to Sparta in 464. Sparta agrees, but then there's an earthquake right afterwards, and the Helots, their slave population, revolt. So the Spartans can't come, and so the Athenians basically win over Thassos and those mining rights, but it's always tricky over there because the Thracians want it. There's always competition to get the gold and silver that's in the northern area. So in 454 BC, 10 years after this, we have a crucial moment. First of all, the Athenians are in Egypt and they're trying to secure the grain that's coming from Egypt, which has lots of grain. And they have a huge naval defeat in Egypt, and so they're seen as weak. Meanwhile, they also, that same year, they take their treasury, which is where all of the Delian League was sending their money in this kind of neutral area in Delos, the home place of Apollo. The Athenians decide they're going to move the treasury over to the Acropolis in Athens. And this is what happens when you are no longer sovereign, right? We saw it with Thassos. They didn't take care of their defense, and all of a sudden, it's almost like Greenland. What we see with Thassos, you see a defense area. Theoretically, they're allies, but we want the minerals, and we see raw power take precedence over, supposed agreements and allies. So what happens when they move the treasury, and with this perceived weakness from the defeat in Egypt, the Delian League revolts. So all that area in orange, the city-states start to revolt from 454 to 451 BC. And the Athenians manage to put out all of these revolts because they're not organized, all of these city-states. They pick them off basically one by one. And they also charge them an indemnity. So in other words, when the rebellion, they basically charge the cities for the cost to put down the rebellion, and then they continue to assign tribute. Now, so this is when symbolically the Athenian Empire goes from basically, when it gets turned into an empire, when it moves from a Delian League, an alliance, into an empire, when it's seen at that moment when they move the treasury over to the Acropolis. Also now, so in the same time, they also insist on the Athenian coinage decree, where they insist on all of the city-states in the Delian League using the owl. And again, you can start to see parallels with the US dollar. In a sense, it's not simply just a financial instrument, but it's also an instrument of what you might call colonization, cultural colonization, colonization of the imagination, so to speak, to remind you every time you use that currency of who's in charge and who runs the show. Now, fascinatingly for me, as I was doing the research for this, so shortly after the moving the treasury in 447, they start building the Parthenon. And you have really all the major building projects on the Acropolis are built within the years that follow, during the Athenian Empire, the years that follow moving the treasury, as well as the tribute that they're taking, which is astonishing. The amount of money that they're taking in is in the neighborhood of 6,000 to 10,000 talents, which is 75 to 150 million, or 75 to 140 million dollars US, is what the Athenian Empire is taking in every year. So it's becoming a huge deal even back then in today's dollars. And so you see the Parthenon there, you see the Propylaea, which is the monumental entrance to the Acropolis in the front. that is 437 to 432 it's built. You see the Temple of Athena Nike, which is 427 to 424. That was after the Battle of Pylos was won. They built that. There's the Odeon of Pericles, which you don't see, which is a theater that's on the side, and the Erechtheion on the left, which was built from 421 to 406. So this was all built during the Athenian Empire. So the point here is we look at these symbols as, symbols of democracy. But they're also symbols of empire, and that these are not mutually exclusive. And as we saw, again, with the example of Thasos. Now, interestingly, the northern mining area continues to be a problem. Amphipolis, there's the First Peloponnesian War, which you don't really hear much about, and as part of the agreement in the 30 Years' Peace in 445, the Athenians are given Amphipolis, and Amphipolis protects the trade route from the Aegean to these mines. So it basically controls the trade route. And in 437 BC, it's not working. So they decide they need to colonize it because there's too much money coming out of there, and it's too far away. So they decide that they need a permanent presence there. And later in 424, Brasidas, a Spartan general, ends up taking over Amphipolis, winning it back, and for Thucydides, the writer of the Peloponnesian War, this was seen as a decisive moment when they lost the northern mining area at Amphipolis, and it was probably a voluntary surrender. Probably Amphipolis was probably thrilled. So, which brings us to the Peloponnesian War, and so there you have Athens on the right, Sparta on the left. And as Thucydides said, this is a classic Thucydides trap, is why his attribution to the cause of the war, which was Athens was becoming too powerful and Sparta was the previous hegemon. And so Sparta felt the need, according to Thucydides, to attack Athens because they were fearing that Athens was getting too powerful. A very similar, situation to what we see with the US and China today. Now, here's more interesting examples of how, we think of Pericles, the leader of the Athenian assembly, as democratic. And I'll read these quotes for you. And he talks, this is Pericles talking about empire. Do not think the only issue at stake is slavery or freedom. There is also loss of empire and the danger from the hatred incurred under your rule. So you are hated as the empire, so there's danger in letting it go. You no longer have the option to abdicate from your empire. Should anyone out of present fear affect this idea and noble-sounding means of disengagement? So we hear this in the US all the time. We should be a republic. We shouldn't be an empire. According to Pericles, this is going to lead to our ruin. Finally, the empire you possess is now like a tyranny, perhaps wrong to acquire it, but certainly dangerous to let it go. If people of that sort managed to persuade the others, they would quickly ruin a city. And even if they set up their own independent state somewhere, they would ruin that too. So perhaps we could imagine maybe this is what's going through the head of the people in power in Washington. Maybe they feel they have to protect their empire. Now, another classic example, and of course we think of Mark Carney last week at Davos. He brought up the specific example from the Melian Dialogue, where the Athenians in 416 BC, Milos was seen as neutral, and so the Athenians went over and they basically said, surrender. They basically laid siege to the city and they said surrender, and the Melians go, what's the issue? I thought you were democratic. Where are your ideals? And that's where we get that famous quote that Mark Carney was mentioning last week. The strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must. So what we see is basically a breakdown of the rules-based order, as they also say, you know as well as we do that right, as the world goes, is only in question between equals in power. Meaning, morality only matters if people are equal in power, according to the Athenians in this episode. And finally, and you think of Pericles' quotes when we hear this one cannot safely let go an empire. especially one that is unwillingly held, right? So again, it's back to this notion that once you have an empire, it's, as Pericles was saying, it's almost like a tyranny. So another lesson here, though, is that the rules-based order is aspirational and that human nature over time will break it, as we've seen actually repeatedly so far here. Finally, as we start to wrap up, so the end of the Peloponnesian War, the second part of the Peloponnesian War, which started in 414 BC, is called the Decalaean War. And it became about the trade routes and attacking the trade routes. So the Athenians in 414 BC, there's the famous Sicilian expedition where they're going to go to the land of milk and honey, Sicily, to take it over, make it a tribute state to the empire, and also conveniently cut off Sparta from its main source of resources. And so that fails spectacularly, and they have a massive defeat in Sicily. There's a great general in Syracuse, Hermocrates, who took out the Athenian fleet, and it was devastating, and they sent a ton of resources that way. Meanwhile, the Spartans take over Decelea, which is in Attica, near Athens, and they cut off the access to the Laurian mines. And so the Greeks no longer have access to their money. Amphipolis, the northern mining, is gone. And finally, in 405 BC, Lysander, a Spartan general, takes out the Athenian navy near the Bosphorus Straits here, which was protecting the grain route and the trade route from the Black Sea, where the grain was feeding Athens. And that was in 405, and basically the war ended with that in 404. So what are the lessons here that we can learn? Natural resources are the source, or put it this way, without natural resources, you don't have geopolitical power. Trade routes are the main points of vulnerability. And so we can look at the current situation with, say, Venezuela. We can look at the Democratic Republic of Congo and the competition there. We can even look at Greenland. Trade routes are the main points of vulnerability. So we can see everything that's going on geopolitically today as a war on China, but it's indirect. It's a war on the trade routes to China that feed China. Other lessons, the rules-based orders are an ideal that fall to human nature. It's something we should aspire to, but we should expect it to fail over time, and we should always aspire to get back to it in theory. Another lesson, once an empire exists, leaders may feel they have no choice but to maintain it. And finally, having natural resources makes you powerful, but it also makes you a target, and maybe a lesson for Canada. Thank you.